Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. You're listening to a show that is all about ideas, about the search for wisdom and knowledge through conversation. My guests all have something to say, and they have the credentials to say it persuasively. Here, the conversation continues. Thank you for joining me for Season 7 of the Optimistic Curmudgeon. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Spencer Klavan, host of the Young Heretics podcast and author of How to Save the West, and most recently, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, How New Science is Illuminating Ancient Truths About God. Spencer, welcome back to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Josh, it's so great to be here. And I have to say, you really planned ahead because my podcast is called Young Heretics. And the longer I do it, the less I am young. I think I remain heretical toward the dogmas of the academy, but I'm always optimistic and I remain a curmudgeon. So really, I feel right at home here.
Oh, well, I'm really glad. I mean, it's I do try to plan ahead, but that one was really an accident that I have to give credit to other people. Bob Luddy handed me a book by Charles Murray about the Curmudgeon's Guide to Workplace Success, and another guy on the team named Grattan Brown was like, "Curmudgeon, what about an optimistic curmudgeon?" And there it is, and that has resonated. Before we get into today's conversation, I do want to plug your previous episode. So. Listeners and viewers, just in case you are really enthralled and want more of Spencer Klavan on the Optimistic Curmudgeon, go back to episode 4x9. That one's called Spencer Klavan and How to Save the West. We had a great conversation about Spencer's first book. And then I should also mention, Spencer was gracious enough to send me an advance copy of his book to help with questions. But I decided, partially because I ran out of time to read the whole book before our conversation today, but also because I don't want to accidentally give any true spoilers. All of my questions are drawn from the introduction of this book. So hopefully that causes you to be thoroughly intrigued and you want to rush out and buy the book. Light of the Mind, Light of the World. I'm confident it's going to be a great read.
So, thank you. And I actually have to say, this book might actually contain some things that could conceivably be spoiled. I'm not sure that was true of How to Save the West, but this is a story, a dramatic adventure story of the history of science. So there are some surprises along the way. So thank you for not spoiling.
Well, yes, I'm happy to not spoil them. I ended up teaching a class that I never expected to teach. I'm a humanities guy through and through, but for as long as I've been in school, people have assured me that I just must take math classes and occasionally science classes, and I always suffered through them. And then lo and behold, my boss handed me a class called Beauty and Wonder in Math and Science last semester. And I turned to my student. I only have one student in this tutorial, and she's a classical education major. I'm a classical ed prof. I was like, look, neither of us are math or science people, but what we can do is we can have a posture of wonder. And we are going to figure out what is absolutely wonderful about the things that the science people love. And we can appreciate beauty. So we're going to learn to appreciate the beauty in math. And that actually turned into an amazing class that we both enjoyed far more than we expected.
Wow, that's fantastic. And definitely speaks to the spirit, I think, in which I wrote this book as well, because I'm not a mathematician or a scientist either, as I say in the introduction. And I expect that there will be people who open this book and think, who is this interloper on the terrain of mathematics, of the hard sciences, this dusty antiquarian emerging from his book basement to talk about quarks and the Higgs boson and all that sort of stuff. But it's for exactly the reason you suggest. We may not be experts in these subjects, but they have an immediate bearing upon our lives. They're often, I think, wielded improperly, illegitimately to either, discredit things that we believe or to tell us how we ought to act. But on the other hand, they're great gifts. They're gifts of God to mankind to know his creation. And we ought to be able at least to stand in awe of them. And I think maybe even to do a little more than that, to use them to understand the world more deeply.
Well, I think that takes us to my first question. Take us back to the idea of this book. Where did this book come from? And say a little bit more about your decision. Did you face any difficulties in getting your publisher to agree to publish your book, since you lack the credentials and we live in a credentials-driven society in some way? It seems like there are always people, there are always exceptions, but like this is definitely a place where I think I'm sure there are physicists out there who are like, Yeah, unless you have a PhD in physics, I'm not interested. But did you face any difficulties in the publication process or with all
It's
that?
really it's really interesting. So I'm lucky that no, I did not, because
Good.
my previous book, as you know, ventured into this territory. And I think basically, I don't know if this is true for other authors, but for me, the next project always comes out of the
Mm,
previous project and the thing in it that you had to leave on the cutting room floor, or that you didn't realize how it was going to engross you. You know, when you're doing research, you always end up kind of down these rabbit holes. And for me, it was the multiverse section, actually, of the How to Save the West book. And more broadly, the argument about God that I make in that book, which
mm,
surprised me by taking me deeper and deeper into the history of science, the philosophy of science, even a little bit of mathematics. I am not an expert in that domain, and I make no claim to be, as you indicate, but I do like to graph things and just play around with like differential calculus and stuff, just kind of dipping my toes, because you do have to do some of that to get a feel for this. But there's not a single equation written out in the book, if anybody's
mm,
scared of that. And on one level, of course, it was very surprising to find myself in this territory and to find myself really intrigued by it. But then when I stepped back and considered it from sort of a broader perspective, I thought it's actually totally normal. And a medieval theologian
mm,
would not at all be
mhm,
surprised to discover that there's a major dominant philosophy regarding the natural world that runs major elements of our society,
mhm,
and that it's relevant to engage with that and to hold it up against faith and to bring faith into conversation with that. And of course, the things that we believe about the world around us have a bearing on the things that we believe about whatever there is beyond this world. This was like not only obvious to the academicians of the medieval universities, but it was almost a premise of their whole enterprise. And so somewhere along the way, of course, as I describe in the book in some detail, science becomes very specialized. You
mm,
get this narrative, this PR routine for various reasons about the war between science and religion. And that credentialism that you mentioned starts to kind of set in, right?
mhm,
Where if you don't have expertise in this domain, you have no right to speak about the meaning of it. But what's really interesting is you notice that if you flip the roles, the opposite is actually not the case. A scientist, an expert in, say, you know, I don't know, in quantum mechanics, an expert in quantum mechanics would very happily opine on, and often scientists do
mhm,
happily opine on, the nature of God, our place in the universe, what their discoveries mean about the larger questions about our lives and our purpose. And ironically, those of us that specialize in that domain will hear people like that talk,
mhm,
like hear, say, somebody like Dawkins, Richard Dawkins talking in public
mhm,
about this stuff, and think these are like not only bad arguments, they're sort of rudimentarily bad arguments. They're the arguments that you first encounter when you have to
mhm,
think through these things. And even if you want to say, as Dawkins does, that there is no God, you have to do that in a much more sophisticated way than he does. So there there came a time, and this really was sort of the 19th century, when science, a word that means knowledge and comes to us via German as Wissenschaft, the knowing
mm,
of things, became the sum total, the kind of pinnacle of knowing, so that scientists are considered equipped to talk about the meaning of their work for our lives, for theology, for metaphysics. But metaphysicians are not considered equipped to enter into
mm.
discussions about or even to understand the implications of some of this advanced mathematics. And I just feel that this is flawed on both sides. This is kind of
Mm,
wrongheaded. We ought to be, scientists and theologians ought to be intimately in dialogue. We ought to know and understand clearly the domains of our respective expertise fields, no question. But we also ought to be able to say, well, okay, you're telling me about an infinitesimally small
mhm,
point out of which the universe exploded into being. That has suggestive, at least, implications for how we read the book of Genesis. And maybe we could talk about that.
Mm.
But the hostility to that is such that even the guy that came up with what is now known as Big Bang Theory, Georges Lemaitre, who was a Catholic priest, had to
Mm.
go in the press and say, this has nothing to do with the book of Genesis. It's on a totally parallel track. And I think, as a matter of disciplinary expediency, there's a way in which that's true, right? You, as a scientist, you wouldn't want to begin from the premise that certain avenues are off
Mm.
limits because they would, quote unquote, disprove God. But at a larger level, of course, it's completely absurd to say that the Big Bang has no bearing or isn't related to Genesis. And it's further absurd to suggest that one or the other answers to these various questions would quote unquote disprove God.
Mm.
It's a category error. I mean, we don't actually look to the material data to answer these sorts of questions. We look to reasoning and metaphysics and kind of prior order questions, which scientists would do well to consider as well. So I really feel like we need kind of a hard reset on this
Mm.
whole range of topics. And it's one reason actually why I wrote the book, was just to say, look, you can tell an intellectually serious
Mhm.
history of science, and you can do it from a perspective that draws out of this story implications for our theological condition that are not just we're
Mm.
all a heap of atoms and we're bopping around in an endless void of nothingness, right? There's more to the story than that. And in fact, modern science, that is cutting edge science, is maybe even more suggestive in this regard than, say, the Newtonian physics of the 17th and 18th centuries, right? When
Mm.
it did sort of start to look like, well, maybe this whole system operates without any kind of mind principle at all. That's
Mhm.
no longer true. And we have this lingering idea that, oh, science is this thing that works entirely separately from God, from mind, from soul, from spirit, from consciousness. The book kind of ends by saying, like, none of that is true anymore. Like, people like Dawkins and Yuval Harari and whoever have been dining out for my whole lifetime on this wildly outdated idea about what science is and what it says.
Mm.
So the book is like just a total, it sort of clears the table and starts again and looks at this enterprise as if it has meaning for us, because natural science always does.
I think it's a vitally necessary project, in part because some of the reading I did last semester hit me in the. It just hit me with just how simplistic our popular vision of Newtonian mechanistic physics are, and
Yeah.
in large respect that those laws are operative in ordinary experience. But it seems to be pretty. There seems to be a pretty universal agreement that at the largest and smallest levels, the rules work far more in far more mysterious ways than we had previously understood, which seems to reintegrate these things with earlier knowledge. I really enjoyed Donald Cowan's book Unbinding Prometheus, and he was a physics professor who became president of the University of Dallas in the 1980s, 1990s. And he believed that physics and poetry really ought to go hand in hand. They both were ways of properly understanding reality. And now he rejected a lot of what Lucretius concluded, but he draws a bit on Lucretius and his poem on the nature of things in order to really kind of do that. And that same tradition goes back to Epicurus with looking at, I mean, he's the one who invented the very idea of the atom, which is, I just think is fascinating that it was a Greek philosopher who came up with this idea and supports your claim that really what we believe about the fundamental nature of reality does have everything to do with how we live and what life looks like and where what we do with that. Now, I do want to throw in one other thought that I don't know if you've had the chance to read a lady named Charlotte Mason, but I'm reading her book this semester called Philosophy of Education. She has a whole view, a totally different view on how people ought to approach teaching science that seems somehow to come in here. She argues, she's writing in the early 1910s, 1920s in England, and arguing that already there's this movement in English schooling to replace the general scientific mentality with a big focus on experimentation. And she argues that really something like 80 to 90% of children don't need to be able to conduct scientific experiments that would meet the scrutiny of lab practitioners. But what they all need is the ability to know a lot about the world, to look at the world with infinite curiosity and wonder, and then be able to
Mm,
study the world deeply and probably to be able to draw vast amounts of the world and then to be
yeah.
really to be set loose to look at reality kind of with the tools of like this is how scientists look at the world. But that the goal of a particularly K-12 education in science ought to be to help foster that mentality and that sense of wonder and beauty in the world rather than a precise technical training in the habits that professional scientists who are conducting lab experiments need. What are your thoughts on that generalist versus more specific kind of scientific training?
Well, I do believe we're in the age of the generalist, personally. I think we've been drilling down so deeply into, as knowledge accumulates, it becomes necessary to specialize. And of course, I've specialized, you've specialized. I think somebody
Mhm.
that wants to live the life of the mind, certainly somebody that wants to live the life of the mind professionally, does have to delve into one subject with great rigor. And so for somebody that demonstrates a kid that demonstrates an aptitude for science, like I don't think wonder is great, and of course everybody should feel it, but like, eventually you're not going to be, mapping tensors and vectors on like sheer wonder alone. Having said that, anybody who does drill down into specialism knows that once you do that, the great secret is every subject is connected to everything else, and
Mhm.
every subject in some ways contains everything else. I'm sort of a crypto fan of the Leibnizian monad idea. So Leibniz, one of the great kind of forgotten, semi-forgotten figures in the history of science, Newton's great rival, might even have
Mm.
discovered calculus before him. There's a big dispute between them over that and gravity and all sorts of stuff, but he's got this very sketchy and, to me, highly evocative idea of the monad, that every point in the universe contains every other by implication, because they're all related to one another. And it's weirdly synonymous with Thomas Traherne, one of the great Christian mystics, not a scientist at all, but the idea that, as William Blake would later say, you're trying to see heaven in a wildflower, and that
Mm.
these individual points that you drill down into kind of explode with meaning and consequence. And I think that we are past the point in intellectual history where we have to pretend that's not going on. For a while, it
Mm.
was good intellectual practice, scholarly practice, to leave mathematics to the mathematicians, to leave philosophy to the philosophers. And when I was in grad school, every paper was prefaced with something like, well, I'm not a philosopher, but like the I am not a lawyer thing, right? So if you had anything to say that bore on anything else, you couldn't talk about it. And I just think that's dishonest. It's dishonest about
Mm.
what got us into this business in the first place. It's dishonest, as you indicate, about what really motivates true pedagogy when you're dealing with students. I think it was Jakob Burckhardt. I may get this wrong, but I think it was Burckhardt who said there's very little that you can give to your students, but you
Mm.
can impart, if you try, a sense that there is joy to be found in the life of
Mm.
ideas. And I just think everything else flows out of that. And even if you go on to specialize, you're still going to be cracking open. Yeah, I mean, you gave a great example, right? The history of atomism. You start out maybe by thinking about this in the modern day. I started, I mean, I'm a classicist, so I had encountered this stuff before, but I started really getting into ancient atomism when I started getting into multiverse theory. And then I was like, well,
Mm.
what's the kind of basis of the multiverse, which is an idea I really dislike. I don't think it works. And I realized, oh, this is like Democritus and Leucippus, right? This is the precursors of Epicurus, who like started on by talking about these atomoi, or the atomon, the thing that is uncuttable. What's the grain of existence that kind of begins to build up the universe? And you realize like that is actually a thread and is motivated by a lot of the same impulses to explain away the appearance of order and design in the universe, to get out of
Mm.
invoking a divine mind that has care for its or his creation. And suddenly you actually realize like everything is this vast network of knowledge. And the idea that anybody disqualified from venturing an opinion is kind
Mm.
of absurd, even before you get into the idea that, like, well, there actually is such a thing as expertise in first principles and these sorts of questions, and it ain't natural science. It's philosophy, theology, right? It's so at the very least, we ought to be talking to each other.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Let's get into some of the stuff from your introduction, and I want to start with two words that you don't actually include, but seem to me to be behind the introduction a lot. This is the second paragraph. You say, "For many, the world has come to look dark and dead, like a machine." That conjured up the term I first encountered in Charles Taylor in his book, A Secular Age. The idea of disenchantment and its opposite, enchantment. And Taylor uses both of these as ways to describe the movement from the early modern to the modern era. To what extent has modern science disenchanted our view of reality?
Well, now I'm going to drop a little spoiler because you're really on the right track. I
Okay.
definitely think that this idea of disenchantment is a really powerful way of characterizing exactly what happened, not at a technical level, but at a spiritual or a cultural level, even in the wake, especially of the scientific revolution, but even as I argue in the book, really in the wake of developments before that. So Taylor's idea of disenchantment, I think, is very closely linked to this older narrative about what happened at the end of the medieval era, right before the Renaissance and the scientific revolution and the Protestant Reformation and all these sort of transformative seismic
Mhm.
changes that created modernity. You get the people arguing over momentum. They didn't call it that yet, but they were trying to figure out how arrows fly through the air. And
Mm.
Aristotle's account, or at least their understanding of Aristotle's account, didn't really give them any good answers because things were supposed to have this dunamis, this power, this innate power within themselves that caused their emotions, that made them go from one place to another. And they couldn't figure out where it was. They were like, well, it's not in the arrow because that's an artifact. It can't be like an embodied arrow wanting to fly through the air. But if it's the air that's moving, is the air kind of like running back around from the front and pushing the arrow forward? Like, what is going on here? None of these answers made any sense. And it was a guy named Jean Buridan and some of his contemporaries that hit upon this idea. Well, maybe there's something called an impetus that is imparted to the arrow by the string and then just pushes it along, that stays with the arrow until it's exhausted by what we would now think of as air resistance. And this is the beginning of Newtonian physics, even though it's
Mm.
many, many for Newton. It's the beginning of the idea that, as Buridan himself begins to speculate, and as Nicolas Orem also kind of talks about, that maybe you don't need angels to push the stars around. Like maybe God imparted this original energy, this activation energy to the universe, and now through what we would now call conservation of momentum, conservation of energy, like now these things kind of move of their own accord. And it's that idea, through no fault or intention of Buridan's or Rem's or anyone's, it's that idea that people for a long time have thought drove the angels out of the heavens. That's kind of how they put it. Because if
Huh.
it's not something within each entity, if it's not that stones have something inherent in them that pulls them to the ground, but rather there is a motive force, a general universal abstract motive force that pulls them down, then not only do you have the precursor of the idea of gravity, but you also have lost a sense of the animate world filled with intention and care at every point and in every moment. And this is in the book. I talk about this as chasing the angels out of the heavens. You could also describe it as disenchantment, and it is a bone deep transformation. First, in the way that
Mm.
eggheads like us think about this stuff, but eventually in the way that everybody even feels his relationship to the world, like how in our bones we sense ourselves in relationship to other
Wow.
objects. And that's disenchantment. In the book, I actually propose a little extra kind of, I should say, riff on this. And that is that disenchantment is only an apparent effect, and it's kind of a trick that we played on ourselves, or a momentary appearance that we got into, which is seen interestingly by a guy that not everybody loves that much, William of Ockham. And William of Ockham says, you know, what is this impetus? Same thing Leibniz is going to say to Newton about gravity. What is this impetus that you talk about? Is it a thing? Is it an entity? It's just another fairy sprite. It's not. It's really only a way of giving some kind of personhood or entityness to what is really simply a pattern of motion and change in the world. And this is what we do with all these words like force and energy. We talk about these things as if they were raw material objects, but there's no such thing as force in the world in the way that there's the chair in front of me that I can pick up and handle. This is an immaterial thing. It's a spiritual thing, even to use older language. And so there's a section in the book called Exiled Ghosts, or Ghosts in Exile, which is what I think actually happened. Not that the angels were chased out, but that they became ghosts in exile. And our whole language became shot through with these dead metaphors that feel like material things, that feel like we're just reducing things to bare objects. But really all we've done is blind ourselves to the reality that the world is still shot through with spiritual force, with more than material things. And in order to understand anything and do science, we have to invoke these kinds of concepts. So the disenchantment of the world may perhaps have been greatly exaggerated. Rumors of the world's disenchantment may have been greatly exaggerated.
Well, that would certainly thrill me if that were the case. 'Cause I've thought for years that the idea of disenchantment, it does resonate in part because I think we all experience the difficulty with articulating why the world is in fact meaningful. Like we know that it is meaningful, but there's something we go by this. I think this is part of why Renaissance studies, Reformation era, early modern Europe, it's such a fascinating time period because here you get you get Martin Luther before the Concord of Worms publishing his natal chart to prove to the entire world that he was supposed to, in fact, turn the world upside down. It was foretold by the position of the stars. And they really did see that meaning in the world in a way that we now know, and I don't even like saying it this way, but we know that the world does not actually work that way. And the easy conclusion is to kind of draw like a pseudo-nihilistic conclusion, say, well, therefore the world doesn't mean anything. And I think that's a huge mistake. And so part of what I've been curious about is into what extent, I think this is what postmodern movement in philosophy utterly failed to lead to. But they were reaching for some sort of re-enchantment of the world. But I think they did it in a terrible way. They just led to, oh, the world is meaningless, and now even my personal world is also meaningless. That doesn't work. But what we need is a right re-enchantment, a truthful rediscovery. So if you're right, and that the angels in the sky are maybe God did give the impetus through gravity or some other force that we haven't named yet to cause things to move. And maybe it's not through angels, but there is still something beautiful, wonderful, and meaningful there. And so discovering that and naming that, I think, is really key to seeing the meaning that is present in reality.
I think this is all very well stated. I want to comment on a few things you said. So, right. I mean, we we might really like to say impetus is the same as the angel Gabriel, right? But that would not I think a disservice to the angel Gabriel, who personally I believe exists, and also to the concept, it would be ignoring the change that really did happen, which is that we found consistent principles of these things. Now, we often confuse this and think we found material principles about these things, but actually we found ways that our mind is capable of organizing our experience of matter. That's what force is. And if you think about that, that's what gravity is, right? It's just a way of and it turns out, right, that it's not, in fact, the tether that pulls you to the ground. It's not some crackling energy stream. It's a curvature in space-time, right? Or that is the closest we have. That's the best way we have to describe it and think about it, is as if, space tells matter how to move and matter tells space how to curve. And even that is just our way of basically saying, under certain conditions, the following things will be observed by us. We will have this. So all of these things that feel to us like material objects, independent of us, outside of us, they're actually mental categories that our minds are capable of using to map the world, and that somehow inhere in the world. And I would say that sounds almost as if God has implanted his word into the world and also echoed it in our minds so that the structure of our mind itself finds an answer in the immaterial but very real structure of creation. And none of that requires us to invoke mumbo jumbo or make up entities that don't exist or pretend that like the fairies are making or holding the protons together or any of that. It's just the science itself is describing a world that is already shot through with the kind of meaning that you're talking about. And I would point you to the end of the book for that very astute point you made about the postmodernists, because this is what surprised me about this book, was that I ended up thinking about postmodernism in a wholly new way, as kind of consistent with, I would group, maybe provocatively, I would group Foucault in a tradition that actually goes back to David Hume and Bishop Barclay. And that tradition, if I had to define it, is the tradition of people seeking an exit route from what they see coming, which is the error of thinking of all things as material, of reality as purely physical or made out of objects. And those exit routes are very imperfect. Hume's philosophy is very imperfect. Berkeley's philosophy is very imperfect. They're different from one another, but they're each reacting. They see more clearly than a lot of other people in their time the problem of matter, right? That's Berkeley's whole thing, is there is no, this thing that you're talking about that is matter. What do you mean? Do you attribute certain qualities to it, like extension in space, motion over time, but these two, right, are bound up with our minds. And this leads Berkeley to conclude that everything is an idea, and I think this is probably wrong, but that's kind of again a precursor to the post-structuralists and the postmodernists, who are also seeking some other thing to say besides just everything is this determinist, ironclad, materialist universe. And as you say, they flee away into like everything is kind of what I say it is. And it's very similar actually to the case of Barclay. And I think like that's kind of revelatory. It shows you why they were trying, what they were trying to do, even though they got everything wrong.
Well, and it, like so many other people in philosophy, and then we have to get back to your book before we start talking about all the great philosophers. But I mean, like all the great philosophers do, even if they are dead wrong, they see something that is, even if it's just in the shape of their question. Like the question is itself illustrative. I mean, I think I went through a Foucault phase, and I usually tell my students I got better. Like it was like a bad flu, but I think Foucault sees power dynamics where there are actual human institutions and relationships. But reading Foucault does make me far more attuned to the way that people are affected by the structures around them. I think Derrida does something similar with language, and I mean, I see he's just so nonsensical. He lost sense very, very quickly. But the best of the postmoderns, and I don't know that those two are the best, but they're the ones I've read the most of. They did see actual problems with modernism, and even though they thought they were something different, but they, like most folks who think they are starting some kind of new revolutionary wave of thought, they were themselves just as modern as the people they were critiquing. But they I think they ask better questions. Like, I mean, the same is true of Heidegger. Like, I don't know, I still don't understand Heidegger's answer to being in time, but I can't quite get his question out of my head. It's like, what exactly is the nature of being? And but you said something earlier that reminded me that I wanted to ask you. You have this, so you have this focus on the mind and the way that human rationality is affecting the world around us. It affects science. And this one line I thought really captured this really well. You were writing here about kind of the Greek sense of an ordered reality, a cosmos. It's natural to look at the stars and wonder why they move across our field of vision. But what's remarkable is that we expect such questions to have answers. Why is that remarkable? Why is it remarkable that we do think there are answers to be found?
Okay, story time. So once upon a time, most people thought that there was a barrier, maybe not a physical wall, but a meaningful boundary at the orbit of the moon. So if you had at this point been able to take up a spaceship, they thought you would get to the moon and then natural law would change. Things would start playing by
Mm.
different rules. It was called the superlunary and the sublunary sphere. And again, it's very difficult for us to even conceive of such a thing. But it was perfectly reasonable to many, many readers of Aristotle to think, well, everything is obviously following these perfect patterns up in the heavens, right? If we could get the right rules, we would be able to chart them exactly, because that's where the
Mm.
angels live. Down here, it's the fall, and things move basically in a rougher sort of way related to the four elements: earth, air, water, and fire, right? Everything is sort of a little bit more jumbled and slightly sketchier. The person who put paid to this idea for good and all, finally, forever, was Isaac Newton. And
Mm.
the radicalism of Newton's discovery, which we don't always appreciate, was not just gravity, it was not just calculus. It was in the Principia Mathematica, he says these are the equations that will predict
Mm.
outcomes and observations everywhere in the universe, throughout the entire domain. Why did Newton, before he found the laws, what set him on the quest for the laws? What set anybody on the quest for, what sets people now on the quest for a way to reconcile quantum mechanics with relativity and to find the solution to quantum gravity? What exactly is it that makes us so sure that our supposedly monkey minds, right, our little cantaloupe brains that did, I believe, emerge over time through the origin of species, probably not in exactly the way that modern evolutionists talk about it. There seems to be problems, but basically, I think like we arose out of natural processes in the earth. And so evolution can give you a perfect reason why you should be able, why you should have certain structures in your brain that predict outcomes of like a lion eating you or not, right? You should definitely be equipped with that sort of apparatus. But what gives you the right to presume that you're equipped to figure out how Saturn moves?
Mm.
The only thing that would suggest that you could break down that kind of barrier, hit upon comprehensive rules for all systems of the kind Newton was describing everywhere throughout the universe, is if you think our minds are not just responding, reacting to their immediate surroundings, but actually imprinted with a key to the whole picture, to the whole logic that was there in the beginning, that was implanted in the cosmos at the beginning.
Mm.
And even though we say we don't believe this anymore, we actually still do, or else we would give up on these projects that we now have of reconciling contradictions. If we didn't think that our minds were special, we would just say, well, there are certain things like the behavior of photons that simply scramble our categories. There is not a box in Paralandra. One of the angels says to Ransom, there isn't a space in your mind, a holding place in your mind for this. It's beyond human experience and perception. Galileo, Newton, those guys said, no, in the material world, actually, we're the key. We're able to understand these things. And it turns out, in fact, that these things, when I say these things, I'm talking about a whole universe of experience that not only is designed for us to know it, but only has its particular shape when we know it. I mean, this is quantum physics sort of
Mm.
revealed to us that all the stuff we think of is totally separate from us. Space, matter, these primary categories like quantity actually are themselves in some sense produced through the relationship between us and the outside world. That the outside world is different without us in it. It's more diffuse, it's more sort of raw potential. It's in what the quantum physicists call superposition or indeterminacy, right? There's kind of an inherent indeterminacy in it that doesn't really answer or conform to our categories.
Mhm.
But once it meets with us, once we experience the world, then the world takes on things like position, location, shape, color, sound, texture, all of the different things that we associate with reality. So not only does this idea that our minds are special, is it not only is it required to make sense of science, to justify the scientific enterprise, to give us confidence that we'll have answers to our questions, it also says something profound about what we are as co-creators of the universe with God. And I think it's why God invites Adam to name the
Oh.
animals. It's like our shaping. the categories that we impose on things make the world ultimately how it was designed to be. That's a very profound passage, and it actually indicates like where all of this physics stuff I think is going.
Oh, interesting. I'm very tempted to abandon my outline and spar with you on interpretations on Genesis.
Oh,
I,
good.
I
Okay. I
I've
mean, go ahead.
often thought I would love to have the opportunity to sit across from Jordan Peterson and ask him why on earth the Bible means everything except what exactly it does clearly mean. Like I feel like
Yeah.
you're moving in slightly similar directions. I'm going to
Right.
resist that temptation, though. Oh no, I'm not completely. Um,
Okay.
uh, Justify for me your claim a moment ago. You took a second in that explanation to say that you do buy origin of species. So why?
Mm,
Like, why do you think that the human race did evolve from prior races? If this mind that you're describing, so the case I heard you make two claims in there. Like one claim was a kind of a modified Darwinian evolutionary schema where man emerges from lower species, while at the same time articulating an incredibly strong view of the human mind, suggesting that in
mm,
fact we actually have something in us that depends on the imago Dei and presumably then divine creation. To so that if we are, as you said, co-creators with God, which is the other language I need to think about before I affirm, but
mm.
that's typically Jewish language that I'm not sure I can affirm from a Christian position. But if let's assume that for argument's sake, if like we have that, how does that emerge through the process of natural selection over an untold span of call it a round number of 365 million years? That's the number when I was a kid. That's probably over a
Okay.
billion years now. It seems to always be in flux.
Cool. Yeah. So let me say at the outset that there are enormous problems with at least what we all learned in school. That like you start with the protozoa, and I mean, first of all, you think of the primordial soup. You just throw a bunch of like molecules together. There is literally no way for you to get life out of that. There are synthetic chemists that try to do this. We have no way of producing the simplest possible living thing. And to imagine it happening spontaneously is a whole different thing. But even if you like put them together in a petri dish, these raw elements of things like DNA, they don't materialize. You can't even force them together. So there's that problem. There's also a problem of time. It does not seem as if there was enough time for these various species to evolve. So
Hmm.
there are all sorts of like wrinkles and issues with evolutionary theory, and it's not my purpose or even my business to endorse one variety of it here. And in fact, in the book, I say like it's really not. It's for I think I say something. It's for others to haggle over fossilized skulls or something. But there's a reason for that, and that is when somebody answers these sorts of questions, if somebody does, it's not going to be me. And I am not the person actually who is you come to for answers about those material questions. This is the sort of thing of which C.S. Lewis says, reason alone cannot tell you whether the cat is in the cupboard. You go and you look. And this is a proper domain for science to be carefully and much more carefully than many evolutionists do, examining the evidence and coming up with kind of their best possible guess. So I personally am kind of agnostic about how we're going to resolve these issues and what ultimately we're going to end up with if we ever end up with something definite about the prehistory of man. So maybe I shouldn't have spoken actually like quite so
Oh,
forcefully about it, but I only want to convey or telegraph that if tomorrow they find like the 10 million skulls they need to chart exactly how
hmm.
this happened, it will give me zero pause or concern about the Genesis account of creation because
Oh,
I think it
no.
is much more profound than that. And here's why, and that will lead in, I think, to answering your next question. If it's the case that the human mind, as I'm arguing, is unique in the world, and that it imprints or is imprinted with the map of creation that God has in mind when He makes the world, then let's say that he has, for the sake of argument, that he has chosen to do this gradually through molding different species and one out of the other in the same way that a seed grows out of a plant, or there are a lot of these metaphors around in the 19th century. Um, if that's true, then at the first moment that it human mind comes online, which again, no idea when that happened, but the first moment that that comes online, whether it's after 7 24-hour days or whether it's after millions and millions of years of careful shaping on God's part, at that very moment, the world becomes different because having human minds in the world changes it. And we often talk in evolutionary discussions. This is a point that Owen Barfield makes wonderfully in the opening of Saving the Appearances. We talk in evolutionary discussions as if we didn't know that, as if we hadn't seen scientifically that actually human consciousness transforms even the nature of time, which is itself conditional upon the presence of an observer or the standpoint of an observer. And if God creates new observers in humanity, it stands to reason that the world then becomes different, looks different to them. And if it's the case that it looks from our perspective, like however many billions of years the scientists say that the universe has been around, to me, that says nothing about whether Genesis is right or not about 7 days, because you're talking there about a whole period of time when there were no human minds to observe. And so we must be speaking from a perspective other than the one in which science speaks, since science naturally and by definition and by necessity speaks in terms of human observation. So my feeling is like we change everything. Part of what happens when we change may be, or maybe when we fall, maybe that the world comes to look to us as if it's built up from steady generations out of kind of primordial slime into more complex species. If it doesn't look that way, the scientists will tell us. I won't. I actually feel like that you want to leave that. But the way that things look to us is, especially in Genesis, not necessarily doesn't threaten to invalidate what Genesis says in my book.
Oh, well, I don't mean to kind of get into the trenches. I don't know if you grew up in these circles, but I grew up in circles where about half the church after service on Sunday would be more than happy to go to a potluck and then throw down over 6-day creationism, and that's never really been my cup of tea. I don't really. There's unhealthy connections to liberal theology if you talk too much about Genesis as myth, if you aren't really careful about defining myth in the right way. I've always had this attraction to the idea that Genesis 1 through 11 are operating on a mythical, or sometimes called universal level, as opposed to a literal narrative historical level. Because there seems like such a break between 11 and then you get to Abraham with 12, and we're clearly in the realm of recorded history, of much more linear narratives and that have been passed down. But I want to shift to a different, kind of a related but different spot. And I'm keeping an eye on our time as we're sort of coming close to the end here. This question is going to take me a second to set up, but it seems to me that a lot of your project in this book is about changing the myth that we currently believe about science, and in the process, changing the myth that we tell ourselves about our own significance as human beings. I mean that, and by myth I mean that explanatory narrative that helps us see the world through the story and see ourselves as part of that story. You have a passage I want to read from page 8 that seems to look at the modern myth of the atom. We've been talking a lot about atoms. I figured this would be appropriate. In the back of almost everybody's mind, there's a script running, an unexamined set of assumptions that shapes the way we see everything. Those assumptions go something like this. The world is made of very tiny ping pong balls moving through empty space. If each ping pong ball were alone in a vacuum, it would move in a perfectly straight line. But since they all jostle each other around, the balls move in a variety of trajectories. If we saw them, they would look random, but actually they're following very complicated geometrical rules based on the collisions among them. Different ping pong balls have different properties and powers, based mostly on the possession of something called energy, which we picture as a sort of crackling light or electric current. Energy is responsible for when the balls do things other than bounce off one another. Sometimes it causes them to latch onto each other, even fuse into one. It arranges them into larger structures like cats and rivers that we see around us every day. In other words, it holds the world together. This seems to me to be kind of the myth that we tell ourselves about the way the world is structured. And I was reading that, I was reminded, you've referenced Paralandra a couple times, and some of Lewis and Barfield both. I mean, I'm reminded of that section in Out of the Silent Planet where Ransom discovers the heavens. And there's this great
Hmm.
mythological reflection on the connotative difference between space as being empty and vacuous and the heavens that thrum with life. And
Hmm.
so I say all of that to ask you to reflect for us on here about in what way are you wanting to kind of re-enchant your readers' minds with a different myth of science, a different myth of human nature, to sort of restore our significance in the created order.
Well, I'm a little bummed that we're almost out of time because personally, I enjoyed
Wow,
our brief
I know.
foray into seven-day creationism
Oh,
enormously, and I hope you don't feel like I mean, that was, like, really,
oh
really
no,
fun. We'll have to get a beer and talk about it more because I think, like,
100%, 100%.
basically what I say in the book is, like, I have nothing but respect for the seven-day creation position. It's not my position, and that having been said, I I think you can feasibly and reasonably stake that claim, but that it might be a mistake to stake the validity of Genesis, to hold Genesis
Mm.
up to possibly unverifiable or verifiable kind
Oh,
of scientific overturn. Because the Genesis is about more than that, as you indicate.
yeah.
This is sort of off topic, but not really, because of what you said about myths, which I will now try to answer directly. Um, okay, yes, absolutely. What I call the balls and lightning theory of the universe in that introduction is, I think, the script that still runs in people's minds, even very sophisticated thinkers about science, when they talk about how they know we're just chemistry sets inside of meat sacks. And what I do in that introduction is just try to show you how it's gotten under our everybody's skin. That we all, it's not that we think this, it's that we feel this. It's that this is
Hmm.
what myth does, is it sort of imbues our daily lived experience, as it were, of the world with a particular flavor and character and quality. And I think the myth that has latched itself onto our sort of neuroreceptors, or whatever you want to say, is junk, is garbage, and is bad science, let alone bad philosophy or mythology. And I think that, putting aside for a second, arguments between scientists and creationists over how much time elapsed from a human perspective before mankind was on the earth, Genesis is a better myth. I mean, Genesis is like so profound as a myth, which, by the way, I'm very much sort of an Augustinian on both Genesis and larger
Ah.
scriptural interpretation, which is to say that you can stack these modes
Yeah.
of reading on top of one another. I happen to think that mythological symbolic reading is the most appropriate and primary mode of thought intended by the Genesis author. That is, that just as there are many genres such as music in the Bible, here we're dealing with somebody that is speaking to us of mysteries prior to human conception, and therefore in terms that don't answer directly to our human conception, but rather use human imagery to convey more than human realities. That's what Milton says about how Raphael communicates with Adam about the war in heaven before he was around. Is, I'm going to use image. I'm going to talk as if there were swords and shields. They're not your swords and shields, but your swords and shields are actually just emanations or images of, like, the reality of what we use in the land of pure spirit. So that's kind of my understanding of how Genesis works. But I also think that you can, if you're Saint Augustine, for instance, in other passages, you can say that these things in the Bible have historical and allegorical and anagogical and ethical meanings, right? That the word of God is sort of like layered with all of this stuff. Um, why does this have to do with replacing the balls and lightning atomic picture of the universe? Well, either you are thinking of yourself as the product of mind and word, which is what Genesis conveys, whatever reading you apply, conveys most directly to us about ourselves, that we are a image of God, created in the image of God through both speech and intention, which are closely linked in the text, as well as out of the dust and out of this matter. Or you think you're a lump of atoms wandering through a cathedral of atoms built by nobody.
Mm.
And not only is the Genesis idea more I think, consistent with modern science at a symbolic level. It's also just clearly better and answers more profoundly to what we feel about ourselves and know, and the way that we act. Genesis is what we act as if is true, that there is a moral universe, that our lives have purpose and all that stuff. The argument of the book is it's also more true and more effective as a tool for thinking about and interpreting the results of the latest science.
Well, it makes for a great argument, and I hope hopefully our viewers and listeners will be inspired to go read it. As I we don't have I would love we okay. This just means we got to do this again,
Yeah.
or you need to come to Raleigh, or I need to come to Nashville, and we sit down together and just hash all this out. But because you're describing I mean, you make a good defense of a polyvalent reading by way of Augustinian theory that Dante agrees with you 100%. But I suspect if we actually do get down to the roots of this is a Catholic Protestant difference, because I am attracted to the fun and the poetic possibilities of that sort of reading that are possible. But I thoroughly still square with the standard low church Protestant necessity of the historical grammatical reading as the primary reading, because I think where scripture does allow for different readings, it is either clear in the text itself. There are, I mean, like Song of Songs is not pretending to be literal. It's clearly figurative language. But then in the few places where you have a confusion, I think scripture is actually really clear about like how we're supposed to read it when we read the confusing portions of scripture in light of the less confusing portions. And I say all of that because I was tempted to go all in on my mythological reading of Genesis, and then I'll shout him out. He doesn't listen to my show often, so if Noah Kelly ever listens to this, this is a shout out moment. He pointed out to me the necessity of the first Adam being historical because of the argument that the Apostle Paul makes in Romans. That is just a straight up logical syllogism. Jesus is the successful second Adam. So where the first Adam fell, the second Adam stands. So if the first Adam is mythological, then Jesus is also mythological. But the entirety of the entire economy of salvation turns on the literal physical death and resurrection of the historical Jesus Christ. So if that's the case, by theological reasoning, the first Adam must be historical, which just kind of shot my fun poetic interpretation of Genesis in the foot. And I was like, Noah, what have you done to me? And
well,
so I
hold on though, but the
no,
first Adam could be historical without totally invalidating a mythological possibility for everything goes before him.
And it does complicate it. It complicates it a little bit further. But we need to we should do an episode in the future on like both of us prep our favorite readings from Genesis, and then we'll just like talk about Genesis for a couple hours. Like that'd be all
really
kinds of fun.
That would be awesome. Yeah.
Spencer, I want to read one last passage, and then we got to wrap this thing up. This was how you close, and I love this closing because it really intrigued me to make me want to read your book more, but it also seems to fit our conversation today. To those with eyes to see, the world described by science is now looking more and more like the God-ordained universe revealed in ancient scriptures. So, to what extent does the quantum revolution push us towards a faith-filled universe?
Well, you're going to have to read the book to find out the answer to that question, which you can pre-order, by the way, anywhere fine books are sold. It's out October 15th. I am currently recording the audiobook, so that'll be up later on. But briefly, I think the quantum revolution explodes the atomic theory upon which much junk scientific mythology is based. It does not actually explode anything Isaac Newton said. Newton was much more sophisticated about this stuff than he's usually given credit for, and knew that he was mapping out ways of charting our experience of and the actual behavior of macroscopic objects. This was then grabbed by the French, like one of those intercepts in football where you're almost at the end of the field and you get like totally sidetracked. Voltaire, Denis Diderot, even Pierre-Simon Laplace, who was perhaps one of Newton's greatest practitioner interpreters, that is one of France's greatest astrophysicists basically ever, still thought that what this meant is you could build the world out of stuff, out of raw matter, and it would work like a machine, and it would need no intervention from anything resembling what we have in our minds. Quantum physics, whatever quantum physics means, whatever interpretation of it you wish to apply, and there are a range of debates over exactly sort of what how we should interpret it, but whatever it means, it ain't that. It does not mean that the world is, it means that the world is not a machine, that mind and consciousness are at least isomorphic with an essential component of reality. And I think if you concede that, then you can get like halfway to God spoke and said, let there be light. But you'll have to read the book and tell me if you agree with me.
That's right. All right. Well, Spencer Klavan, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been a really fun conversation.
A true delight. And yeah, a joy anytime.
Well, thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us today here on The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My name is Josh Herring. I'm your host. And today my guest has been Spencer Klavan, host of Young Heretics and author of your next pre-order, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, out on October 15th, 2024. You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit the subscribe button and share it with your friends. If you want to let me know what you thought about the episode, or if you want to sponsor an episode, you can always message me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Just search for The Optimistic Curmudgeon. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Until next time, seek the good, pursue the true, and love the beautiful.